Its value has never been measured by the apples it grows. He said it to the agricultural consultant, who had driven out from town specifically to tell him what everyone else had already said, that the old tree in the middle of the orchard was taking up space, producing almost nothing, and should be replaced with something younger and more productive. The consultant had numbers. Thomas Carter, 60 years old, smiled and said the same thing he always said, and the consultant left the way everyone left, without an answer that satisfied him. His grandson Ethan, 10 years old, had been close enough to hear. "Grandpa," he said, "what does that mean?" Thomas looked at the tree. It was old, older than his marriage, older than his son, older than most of the orchard around it. It produced perhaps 30 apples in a good season, which was nothing compared to the hundreds hanging from every other tree. "It means some things are worth keeping for reasons that can't be counted," he said. Ethan looked at the tree. He looked at his grandfather. He had the expression of a child who has been given a piece of information and has decided, correctly, that there is more underneath it. The grandchildren had been at the farm for 2 weeks that summer. Thomas was happier than he had been in 3 years, since the spring his wife Ruth had passed. And the happiness was the specific kind that comes from a house that has been quiet for too long and is suddenly full of noise again. Ethan and his 8-year-old brother Liam argued about everything and were inseparable. Their 5-year-old sister Sophie followed Thomas everywhere like a small determined shadow. Asking questions he answered with the patient seriousness she required. His son David and daughter-in-law Mara were grateful for the farm, the space, the dinners that lasted 2 hours, because Thomas told the stories he had been storing up since they had last visited. They sat on the porch every evening, watching the sunset over the orchard, and Thomas looked at his family, arranged in the porch chairs, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 3 years. But the children were noticing something. Every morning, someone came to the farm, not to buy apples from the main orchard. Those were sold through the usual channels, to the market, to the vendors, at the harvest festival. These visitors came for the old tree, an elderly couple on Monday, a young mother with 3 children on Tuesday, a retired veteran who came alone and stayed quietly for 10 minutes, a family of 4 who had clearly driven from somewhere else. Each one walked directly to the old tree. Each one picked a small amount of apples. Each one thanked Thomas, not with the brief transaction of a customer, but with the particular warmth of someone who is thanking a person for something larger than what it appears. Thomas charged none of them. Ethan asked his father, "Why does Grandpa only give away apples from that tree?" David shook his head, with the particular smile of a man admitting something. "I've wondered my whole life," he said. "I never asked." The harvest festival came on a Saturday in September. The farm opened to the whole town. Music, apple pies, fresh cider, children on hay rides. The orchard was full of people moving between the trees. Thomas had been running this festival since before David was born. The grandchildren noticed it again. Families did not go to the largest, most productive trees the way the serious buyers did. A steady procession of people throughout the day made their way to the old tree. Parents lifted children to reach the branches. People stood under it and took photographs. Several stopped to embrace Thomas before they left, with the specific warmth of people who are thanking someone for something they have never said directly. David watched. Mara watched. By the afternoon, they were both watching without knowing quite what they were seeing. That evening the family sat around a small bonfire in the field after the festival had ended and the farm had gone quiet. The stars were out. Sophie was asleep against her grandfather's arm. The bonfire made the old apple tree visible at the edge of the orchard, the only tree they could see clearly from where they sat. David said, quietly, with the tone of a question he had been holding for 30 years, "Dad, I grew up on this farm, and I've never understood why that tree matters so much to you. Will you tell us?" Thomas looked at the tree for a long moment. He looked at his grandchildren, Ethan and Liam, awake and watching, Sophie asleep against his arm. He looked at his son, who had been asking this question with his eyes for as long as he could remember. "When I was about Ethan's age," he said, "our farm failed completely. 2 bad seasons in a row. We barely had enough to eat that winter." He paused. "One afternoon, my mother and I were walking past a stranger's orchard. We didn't have money, not enough for a single apple." He looked at the fire. "The farmer came out. He looked at us. He didn't ask questions. He walked to one old tree in the corner of his orchard, and he said, 'The apples from this tree are never for sale. If a family is hungry, they belong to them.' My mother filled one small basket." He paused again. "That night we didn't go to bed hungry." The fire crackled. No one spoke. "I never saw that farmer again," Thomas said. "I never had the chance to repay him. So I made myself a promise. If I was ever blessed with my own farm, there would always be one tree whose apples could never be bought, only shared." David lowered his head. Mara pressed her hand over her mouth. Ethan stared at the tree with the expression of a child who has just understood something that will stay with him for the rest of his life. The next morning, before Thomas came down for breakfast, the 3 grandchildren disappeared into the barn. They emerged an hour later with a piece of wood, paint, and the focused energy of children who have a clear mission. Thomas watched them from the kitchen window. They walked to the old tree. They drove a stake into the ground beside it. They hung the sign they had made. He went out to read it. "If you're hungry, this tree is yours." Thomas stood in front of the sign for a long moment. The letters were uneven, and the paint had dripped slightly, and it was the finest thing anyone had ever made for him. He turned around. His grandchildren were watching from 10 feet away, with the anxious, hopeful expression of children waiting for a verdict. He walked to them, and he held all 3 of them at once, Sophie in one arm, Ethan and Liam pressed against his sides, and he stood in the orchard with his family in the September morning and understood that he had not simply kept an old tree. He had passed something forward. David came out of the farmhouse and stood at the edge of the orchard and watched his father holding his children under the old apple tree, and understood, finally, the weight of what his father had been carrying, and the specific, careful way he had been carrying it, not as a burden, but as a debt he was paying to a stranger he had never been able to thank. Through every family who came to the tree, through every apple given without a price, through 30 years of a promise kept in the middle of a prosperous orchard. "Dad," David said quietly from the edge of the orchard. Thomas looked up. "I should have asked sooner," David said. "You asked at the right time," Thomas said. "They needed to hear it too." He looked at his grandchildren. Ethan was already reading the sign again, with the expression of someone taking notes. Kindness is the only harvest that grows stronger when it's freely shared. Some legacies aren't measured in land or money, but in the doors we leave open and the fruit we choose to give away. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let's spread more stories of kindness and hope together.